Greetings and welcome to Converging Streams, Interfaith Fellowship in Our Modern World. Our program is a production of the Muncie Interfaith Fellowship and the Unitarian Universalist Church of Muncie. This week's program, part 1 of 2, Modern-Day Faith Activist with Reverend George Wolfe and guest Mark Massey.
Hello, and welcome to Converging Streams. It is my pleasure today to have with us in the studio Mr. Mark Massey. Mark Massey has taught in the journalism department at Ball State University for many years, but he's also been a very active freelance writer. And he recently published a book through Indiana University Press entitled Inspired to Serve, Today's Faith Activists. Mark, welcome.
Thank you very much, George.
I'd like you to talk about the individuals you've written about in the book. They're fascinating, and the projects they're working on are so meaningful and important to bringing about positive change in the world today. But first, I'd just like you to talk briefly about what inspired you to take on this topic.
Well, to start with, Inspired to Serve was motivated by individual life stories. I should backtrack and say that for many years I've been interested in social issues. I was a sociology major at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and I began my career in government, actually, not in journalism. But I've long been interested in how people can affect change in society. And as someone who came of age in the 60s, I was very familiar with activist causes, with the work of the Kennedy brothers, with Martin Luther King, with individuals such as the Berrigan brothers, and other people who stepped forward during times of crisis to try to affect positive change in society. In this particular case, in the writing of Inspired to Serve, it was actually done in a series of stages. I began with a story on an activist Jesuit priest in Portland, Oregon, shortly after I completed my graduate work at the University of Oregon. And from there, a number of steps came into play. I met other individuals. There were referrals, some from national leaders, and others from other journalists who had been covering similar types of stories. And lo and behold, that's how the book was put together.
Now, I noticed that everybody in your book is connected with some religious tradition. Not necessarily Christian, not necessarily Jewish, but you have a Buddhist represented in your...
That's correct.
Also a very important Islamic activist, isn't that correct?
The premise of the book is that no one religion and no one political perspective can claim dominance over an area such as social activism or faith activism. I think often in the mainstream media, people tend to perceive that an activist is of one particular political bent, and perhaps a faith-based person is of another specific religious inclination. What I set out to do was to look at religious perspectives and faith perspectives and how they influence people to become active in their communities, whether it's working on anti-poverty programs, whether it's working on community education, housing, employment, any number of issues. And in this book, you will read about not only the Christian perspective, and within the Christian perspective, it runs the gamut from evangelical Christian to more mainstream Protestant denominations, Catholic. But then I also wanted to include other faith perspectives. And I included an activist rabbi from Denver, Colorado, an activist, community activist, and an interfaith worker, a Muslim. Actually, he's a psychiatrist in the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas, and also a person who was raised Lutheran but who has been active in the Buddhist faith. And so I tried to incorporate a number of religious and faith perspectives in the book.
Well, probably one of the most familiar people is Father Roy Bourgeois. Perhaps we could start with these activists individually by talking a little bit about how you came in touch with him and what he's been working on.
Father Roy Bourgeois would probably be the best known of all of the activists. There are 12 chapters in the book, and one of those chapters profiles a couple in Boston. This book goes into great depth in terms of their life stories. These are more than interviews. I spent time in what's known as immersion journalism, and so I spent a great deal of time with each of these individuals, getting to know them as people as well as activists. In Roy Bourgeois' case, he has been active in an organization. He founded School of the Americas Watch, which is based in Columbus, Georgia, near the grounds of Fort Benning. I had learned of Father Roy through the first person I profiled in the book, Father Gary Smith, who was the Jesuit activist in Portland, Oregon. He had spoke about Roy Bourgeois as someone who really understands that when you're talking about faith, and I like to talk about different aspects of faith in terms of activism, there's often a leap of faith, there's the risk of faith, and there's the gift of faith. The risk of faith is if you're going to put yourself on the line, you better be willing to pay the price. And Roy Bourgeois was someone who was described to me as someone who had paid the price. He has lived through death threats. He has served prison terms for the courage of his convictions. But I hadn't met the man until he came to speak at Ball State a few years ago. And actually through Jerry Waite, who teaches in the anthropology department at Ball State, Father Roy Bourgeois came to Ball State. I met him and told him about the book that I was working on and would he be willing to be one of the subjects. It took about a year before I was able to go on site for their annual vigil, which is in November. And the goal of the School of the Americas Watch is to close an institution on the grounds of Fort Benning. It isn't Fort Benning, it's on the grounds of Fort Benning. And this institution has been implicated by Amnesty International as well as by members of Congress in training death squads and police operations in Latin American countries. And so for the better part of, it's going on now, 15 years, Father Roy has built an organization with the goal of trying to close this institution. And each year they do have an annual vigil, and during the rest of the year he goes around the country giving talks to different groups.
Let me just add for our listeners that Father Roy spoke at Ball State, sponsored by the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies. And this year we had several students go down to the School of America's Watch, several students from Ball State who were members of the Peace Workers Student Activist Group. Now, the Buddhist individual that you have listed in your book, perhaps you could tell us a little bit more from of your experience with him.
Mark Gonerman is a very interesting story. He was somebody raised in a very strict Lutheran household in Minnesota. He, when I met him, he was finishing his dissertation at Stanford, although he had taught at Stanford in different departments for several years. He had also been a educator at Harvard, and he came to Buddhism while studying in Japan, and he embraced the philosophy of Buddhism, and in later life he became much more aware of the possibility of socially engaged Buddhism. And many people almost would see that as an oxymoron. The common perception might be that a Buddhist is basically, for lack of a better word, que sera, sera. That's not the case with socially engaged Buddhism. He studied Gary Snyder, who was a beat poet and also a conservation activist. And Mark Gonerman ended up doing approximately 500-page dissertation on Gary Snyder. And that brought him into the fold of an activist Buddhist philosophy. And what he's done at Stanford is he pioneered a group called the Aurora Forum. And the Aurora Forum consists of a series of community education events that's held in the Northern California area, primarily at Stanford, but he also goes to San Francisco and other communities. And the goal is to raise people's awareness of socio-political economic issues. And he's been very successful, I think, in raising the consciousness of people in that community.
I find it interesting you mentioned this misconception that people often have about sort of the Eastern religious perspective. You called it the Que sera, sera Buddhism.
Probably mixing metaphors there, but
the same misperception, I think, is about people from the Hindu tradition. I know when I was in India, I noticed coming out of Hindu temples, for example, there were long lines of people who were homeless, but sitting outside along the side of the streets with plates, and people from the temple would be serving them food because it was an outreach to help the hungry. And the Indian community in Muncie, particularly those who are from the Hindu tradition, are very active in supporting the food pantry that is held at the Friends Memorial Church downtown. They're consistently there every time it's held once a month to help the people in Muncie who are less fortunate. So I think that activism is very present in Buddhism and Hinduism, as well as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
And I think along those lines, the term activism may promote an image of a very assertive or aggressive, confrontational person. The other goal that I had in this book was to cut through perhaps some of these stereotypes that an activist is one type of person. There are many types of people who believe that they can do good within their communities, and that's what I try to do with this book also, is select individuals that demonstrate not only a range of faith and religious perspectives, but also individual personality types, because I think individuals might want to do something in their own communities, might want to try to make a difference, but they might be shy, they might be a little bit timid about putting themselves out there, and they may say, well, I'm not really an activist because this is not really my personality type. I think when you read the book, Inspired to Serve, what you'll find are a range of stories of people, and they do represent a range of character, personality types, and I think that can also help people get a better grasp on what activism really is. It isn't just a protest march or some other type of action, which typically is how the media cover social activism.
Right. It really has to do with reconciliation and also bringing about positive change in the community.
I think one of the best quotes in the book comes from Rabbi Steve Foster, who has been rabbi of a Reformed congregation in Denver for many years, and he quite simply said, never underestimate the good that you can do. And when you really take that to heart, I think it could apply to many, many people. You don't have to think about organizing a large rally. You don't have to think about, oh my gosh, how would I do a food drive? Or how do I get that abandoned house on the corner knocked down, or perhaps a home, a better home erected, even perhaps something that might help people who are poorer than I am. If you really take the belief that you can make a difference, I think that's one of the best lessons that this book has for you.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us today. We'll have to have you back so we can hear more about the fascinating people you've written about in your book. The book is entitled Inspired to Serve, Today's Faith Activists. It is published by Indiana University Press, written by Mark Massey, and the phone number, if you would like the 800 number, is 800-842-6796, and the website iupress.indiana.edu. This is George Wolf for Converging Streams.
Thank you for listening to Converging Streams, Interfaith Fellowship in Our Modern World. Our program is a production of the Muncie Interfaith Fellowship, with content and financial support from the Unitarian Universalist Church of Muncie and technical support from radio stations WCRD and Work FM. Most importantly, we thank you, our listeners and followers, for your support. To connect with Converging Streams, including listening to our entire catalog of past programs, getting our latest new content, and making your own contribution to this program, visit our website, convergingstreams.org. Converging Streams is produced by Tony Piazza, George Wolf, and Thomas Perchlik. Thank you for listening and have a pleasant week.